We are going to look at two similar questions of the same type today, and they're both quantitative questions. They're questions that ask us to interpret graphs. So we're going to do a simpler one first and then a more complicated one. The first one is this one, question 7. So this is from a passage that is about national parks in the United States. It's asking us which choice provides accurate and relevant information from the graph. And so let's take a look at the paragraph in which question 7 is embedded. According to a report from Headwaters Economics, a research group that studies land management in the West, rural counties with more than 30% of their land under federal protection, and here's the underlined bit, saw job growth of more than 300% from 1970 to 2010. Rural counties with no protected land saw smaller increases in employment than did counties with protected land. So what we want to do here is evaluate whether or not that statement is true per the graph, and if it's not, which of the other choices is correct. We're looking at the graph, we see that the graph goes from 1970 to 2010. It's tracking percent employment change in the rural West. So really all we need to do here is evaluate a claim against the graph, and just read the graph correctly. So we're looking at specifically rural counties with more than 30% of their land, and whether or not it's true that they had job growth of more than 300%. So great, let's compare rural counties with more than 30% of their land and see what the case is. Okay, so the y-axis here is percent of county land base federally protected, and more than 30% protected results in a 345% employment change from 1970 to 2010. So it seems to me that this is accurate and relevant information. I would choose no change, even before even looking at the other choices. On test day, that would be enough for me. I would move on. But since this is an instructional video, let's go through the other choices and knock them out, just to make sure. Option B, rural counties with more than 30% of their land under federal protection saw slightly less job growth than those with less than 10% of lands under federal protection. So that's saying that things in this group and this group would have greater job growth. And we can see that 108% and 83% growth is smaller than 345% growth. So I'm going to cross that off. Had rates of job growth that were considerably higher than those of rural counties in the eastern United States. Well, the graph isn't talking about the east, it's talking about the west. So we can cross this off as well. Rural counties with more than 30% of their land under federal protection saw job growth decline from nearly 350% to just under 300%. Now, it is true that there is a figure that is just under 300% in the graph, but it's talking about a different class of county. It's talking about counties with more than 20% protected land. And the graph does not bear this out. It's talking about a completely different thing. Great. So all I needed to do was take the sentence and plug it into the graph. You know, we have this 30% here, and that corresponds to the 30% bar in the bar graph. Meanwhile, let's look at question 9. Okay, at this point, the writer wants to use information from the table below. Which choice provides accurate and relevant evidence from the table to support the paragraph's claim? So first, let's figure out what the paragraph's claim is. So we've already read most of this paragraph. Let's look at the part that we haven't talked about yet. A look at the economic effects of Yellowstone National Park reveals the profound impact protected lands can have in a rural region. In 2013, Yellowstone had more than 3 million tourists. They spent a total of nearly $380 million in and around the park. And likewise, from the earlier question, we saw that it's true that rural counties in the West with more than 30% of their land under federal protection saw job growth of more than 300% from 1970 to 2010. So I think that the paragraph's claim is that public management of lands in the West leads to job growth and lots of park visitor spending. Okay, so now let's look at this table. Economic contribution of tourists to the region of Yellowstone National Park. So we have the total number of park visitor spending, and jobs created. And then they've broken that down into how much the total is and how much is from tourists. So tourists here, and then tourists plus locals, and how much and what percentage of visitors, what percentage of revenue, and what percentage of jobs come as a result of tourism in Yellowstone National Park. And so these choices are going to be placed at the end of the paragraph to kind of put a capper on the paragraph. So we're looking for something that has to do with this figure, this $380 million, and connects to the idea that tourism and therefore public land management is good for the rural West. So choice A, these tourists made up nearly 97% of all the visitors to the park in that year. That is true. Almost 97% of visitors to the park were tourists, but that would make a little bit more sense if it came after this sentence here. Yellowstone had more than 3 million tourists. These tourists made up nearly 97% of all the visitors to the park in that year. But it doesn't seem connected as strongly to the $380 million amount, so I'm going to cross it off. Choice B, this incoming money, and that is referring to the $380 million, was enough to support more than 5,000 jobs in the Yellowstone region. Okay, so just from tourists alone, were there more than 5,000 jobs created? The answer is yes. And that is accurate, and is it relevant? And I think the answer is yes, it is relevant because the claim is that tourist money from public land management in places like Yellowstone create sustainable jobs for the region. On test day, I would be happy with that. I would move on, but let's check out C and D. Residents of the region tended to spend less money in and around the park than tourists did. Now, to me, this is a confusingly worded choice. We don't have information on the per capita spending level, right? We don't know whether or not individual park visitors who were tourists or locals spent more or less money per person. It is certainly true that there's only about 100,000 non-tourist park visitors in 2013, but that's not really relevant, and also we can't answer this question as worded with the information that we have. D actually looks similar. As per visitor spending in the park shows, visiting Yellowstone is a relatively economical vacation. We don't know what per visitor spending in the park is, according to this graph. We can divide the amount of park visitor spending by the number of park visitors, but we don't actually know what the average spend is per visitor. So I'm going to cross it off. And that leaves us with B. So for this kind of quantitative question, I had to do a couple of different things. I had to synthesize the meaning of the paragraph, what's the main claim of the paragraph, and then I had to look at the graph and see what matched the claim. And I had to evaluate what was not just accurate, but also relevant to the claim. So a multi-step process here. Figure out the claim, then look at the graph, then connect the claim to the graph, then check that claim and that data against the choices.